The New Testament is a sacred text for Christians, but for generations, it's also been read in ways that fueled misunderstanding, hostility, and even violence toward the Jewish people. What if we've been missing something, not just about Judaism, but about the New Testament itself? Well, my guest today is Dr. Jesper Svartvik, a Lutheran theologian and longtime leader in Jewish-Christian relations. His new book is called Jewish Foundations of the New Testament, Addressing the Roots of Antisemitism. And in this conversation, we explore how Christian interpretation has often distorted the Jewish context of the New Testament, and how reading these texts without supersessionism can open up new insight, healing, and understanding. All right, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jesper Svartvik to the Bridge Builders Forum today. So Dr. Svartvik is the former Krister Stendahl Chair of Theology of Religions, which included teaching and research both in Jerusalem and in Lund, Sweden. He is currently canon theologian in the Diocese of Karlstad Church of Sweden. So Dr. Jesper Svartvik, so great to have you on the Bridge Builders Forum today. I'm excited to be talking about your new book today.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to discuss these issues with you.
Yes, and we're gonna really dig into your book, but I'm just gonna say it right out of the gate that I've read your book. It's brand new, published by Paulus Press. Of course, it's available on Amazon, but I just really want to encourage folks to get it. This is a great book to read all the way through. We're going to talk about why it's so important for understanding the New Testament and also challenging anti-Semitic interpretations of the New Testament. But it's just a great reference because he covers a lot of texts, and we're going to sample some of those. But Jesper, before we even get into the kind of the heart of the book, I would love for you to share a little bit of your personal story so folks can get to know you. Of course, in addition to being a scholar who's been deeply engaged in Jewish Christian education, relations, dialogue, and so forth for many, many years. You're also an ordained Lutheran minister. So can you just share a little bit of your journey and how you got into this field? And I would also love to hear, I'm a huge fan of Krister Stendahl, and so I would love to hear how he was maybe part of your journey as well. So tell us a bit of your story.
Well, thank you. I too, I'm a huge fan of Krister Stendahl and the Stendahl legacy and what he wrote and what he meant. So my earliest encounter with academic theology was 5 years or so at Lund University in my native country, Sweden. But I have to say that Jews were rhetorical Jews and Judaism was a gloomy background. And it was only when I was granted a scholarship for studies for a semester in Jerusalem in the spring 1990 that this changed. And I encountered a vibrant, living Judaism, and that made all the difference for me.
Wow.
And I applied for another scholarship a couple of years later. So I returned in 1993 as a visiting research student scholar at Hebrew University. So then I studied in a first semester, I studied among Swedes, but the second time when I returned, it was in an entirely Jewish context. And that was very important 2 semesters for me, spending those in Jerusalem. So I returned back to Sweden. I wrote a doctoral thesis, defended it at Lund University, worked for 10 years, as you said, as a Krister Stendahl professor in Jerusalem, with the teaching load both in Jerusalem and Lund. And then when I wrote this book, I spent almost a year at Boston College. So that was a short story.
A short story, yes. So really until 1990, when you say, I guess, Jews and Judaism, it was more rhetorical, I guess. You had not had a lot of direct personal engagement with Jewish people and seen kind of Judaism lived out up until that point. Is that correct?
No, not many. I mean, I had a classmate. His father was a visiting scholar from Canada, I believe, and they spent a year and many summers not far away from where I lived where I grew up. So I had Jewish friends, and I went to a bar mitzvah, etc. But the Jewish minority in Sweden is very, very small. I mean, I guess some 20,000. Most of them live in Stockholm and Gothenburg, and very few in Lund. So that's why I said we kept reading about Jews and Judaism in all subjects like church history and systematic theology, biblical studies, of course. But it was always something odd, something different it was always taken for granted that the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, that the New Testament was the only obvious result of the Hebrew Bible, so to speak, or the continuation of the Hebrew Bible. And it was only, as I said, in Jerusalem, living among Jews, being invited for Shabbat meals Friday evenings, and visiting synagogues and discussing the Parashat HaShavua, the weekly portion of the Torah with my friends, Jewish friends and colleagues. It was only then that it became, as I said, this living, vibrant religious tradition.
Yeah. So I'm sure that must have challenged a lot of your, or well, let me ask this as a question. Did that living experience, those relationships, and that sort of obviously going to Jerusalem, you were immersed, you were at the heart of, of the vibrancy of Judaism and Jewish culture and people. I'm sure did that challenge a lot of your assumptions about Jewish people and Judaism?
It did. And both that it encouraged me to study more about Judaism, especially Jewish texts and hermeneutics, the interpretations of Jewish texts, which was a remarkable, wonderful experience for me. But also the flip side of that coin, to learn more about the long, horrible history of anti-Semitism, and that the role that bishop, priests, and ministers and church people involved in church, that they have played in that history. I remember my very first visit to Yad Vashem, the museum and research center and educational center for the study of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and I remember specifically how often crosses and Christian symbols and Christian people, they were there in art and in pictures, etc. So I had not until that day, my very first meeting at Yad Vashem, understood how close, from a Jewish perspective, how close the cross is to the swastika. And it's perverted, but it's as two symbols, they are very similar. And from a Jewish perspective, I started to understand how difficult it has been to see a cross and remember what the cross represented. Because for me, coming from a, so to speak, Christian country, where Christianity is the major religion, to realize that what's so important to so many Christians is so very difficult, because Jews have either own experiences or their families have experience of how bad Christians have been teaching about them, and how bad they have been treated.
Yeah. No, I can imagine how just those experiences just personally affected you, just being in Jerusalem. So, and of course that really, I guess in many ways, it shaped or impacted the trajectory of your academic and professional career, and is really ultimately, or at least most recently, led to this new book that I want to ask you a lot about, because again, as I mentioned already, I appreciate it so much. So I have a bunch of questions about your new book, which I have here sitting next to me, which is titled "Jewish Foundations of the New Testament: Addressing the Roots of Anti-Semitism." But so I've got some specific questions. But before we do that, what inspired you to actually write this particular book?
I felt that after all these years, as I said, this trajectory that began in 1990, that it was time for me to summarize what I had been teaching and reading and preaching for almost 30 years.
Right.
So after the 10 years in Jerusalem, I returned to Sweden, and a colleague made me aware of this possibility to apply for, there's a visiting chair at Boston College, and they want someone to go there and to write a totally new book, a new project. I gave courses, I hosted conferences, and I also was asked to write this new book. And it took me some time to find the format of it, because I wanted it to be a one volume, accessible for a wide audience, not only the ivory towery member of the academic community, but trying to reach out to, since the problems I want to address are not only in this ivory tower, but everywhere where the people open the New Testament, they read the text with anti-Jewish glasses, I would say. That's a default setting very often. So I applied for that, and I was delighted that the colleagues at Boston College wanted me to come to Boston. I was there. I was the visiting professor for 2 years. Unfortunately, the pandemic came along. So that in the beginning, I worked from Sweden, but as soon as I could, I went to Boston, and it was a remarkable experience for me to be there and to have discussions with my colleagues and to continue working on this project.
Yes. And just for folks who may not know, at Boston College, there's a center. There's a center there that is called the Center. I believe it's the Center for Jewish Christian
Learning. Yes,
Learning Center for Jewish Christian Learning, and that's something worth looking up, because there are many online programs that you can. I love following, and actually, I heard you recently give a presentation on your book through that venue. And so there's a lot of really neat programs and things that they're doing. So just wanted to mention that. And also regarding, the effort with your book, again, one of the things that I feel like is valuable is that you did make, this is a readable book. It's excellent scholarship, and but it is also accessible to I think a broader audience, that I think is a great feature of the book. So, Jesper, in the introduction, you noted that it's often taken for granted that the Jewish background of the New Testament, by definition, is gloomy, burdensome, and defective. And you mentioned, which I thought was so helpful, you mentioned these 4 very common deceptive dichotomies, was the wording that you used, that essentially pit the teachings of Jesus against Jews and Judaism. So just briefly, and again, I want folks to buy the book and read more in detail on these, but walk us through these dichotomies and explain why they've had such a lasting impact on Christian interpretation of the New Testament.
So the 4 words that I discuss in the introduction to the book are Pharisees, Jews, law, and covenant, and especially new and old, the new and old binary pair of covenant. And I connect those 4 concepts to 4 different parts of the New Testament. So especially in what scholars call the synoptic tradition, i.e. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we meet Pharisees. And those Pharisees, they are worldwide, they are known all over the world, the Pharisees. Not very often is this based on scholarship, but they are known as hypocrites. So that's the first word. What do we mean when we talk about Pharisees? And then I continue discussing the Gospel of John. And John doesn't mention Pharisees very often, but he has another word. And in Greek, it's Judaios in the singular and Judaioi in the plural, very often just mechanically translated as Jews. So if Jews are mentioned less than 20 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke together, they are mentioned at least 70 times in just the Gospel of John. And therefore, I say that's the second stumbling block for Christians in order to understand what Judaism is all about, that they read the Gospel of John and they think that it is Judaism per se, the true essence of the Jewish tradition in all this variety that is presented when they see the word Judaios. And then the third word is connected to the epistles of Paul. In the Pauline letters, there is often a discussion of law. And for me, coming from the Protestant tradition, as you said, I'm an ordained Lutheran minister. Law has become, it's a very important word for Lutherans, Lutheran congregations, that gospel is the message that Christians want to convey. And law is the opposite of gospel. And
so that dichotomy,
yes, that's a really dichotomy, the deceptive dichotomy.
Deceptive dichotomy. That's the key. We're talking about deceptive dichotomies that obscure rather than really help us to understand what's happening.
Yes.
So
because if we scratch the surface behind law, we have lex in Latin, we have nomos in Greek, and we have Torah in Hebrew. And if you only want to learn one word, if you're a bit lazy and you only want to learn one word in Hebrew in order to understand Judaism, it should be Torah.
Torah, yeah.
And Torah is the most beautiful, most central, most cherished, most loved word, concept in Judaism. You could look at the prayer in the synagogue talking about the Torah, and you could feel that is so similar. It's a parallel in terms of its role in worship to Jesus of Nazareth Christians. So it would be, if you say, I belong to a new religious movement, and we want to say that we are the opposite of Jesus of Nazareth. That is, if you think of it as a deceptive dichotomy, if you say that the purpose, the mission, the goal of Christian faith is to crush the law, the curse of the law, or everything that, then, as you say, it's a deceptive dichotomy. Then Christianity becomes anti-Jewish. And if you're still a bit lazy and you only want to learn two words in Hebrew, if the first one is Torah, meaning the revelation, the 10 Commandments, the 5 books of Moses, the everything that's positive in terms of revelation. If you want to learn a second word, still, as I said, a bit lazy, then you should learn the word Brit, meaning covenant. And that's the fourth word. And especially in epistle to the Hebrews, where it talks about covenant, and Christians are very often like Pavlov's dogs. So when they hear the word covenant, they think immediately, this must be Christianity versus Judaism, because it talks about all the new covenant. And I'm so very much convinced that the perspective in Hebrews is similar to the one that we have in the synoptic traditions, that we have in the Pauline letters, that the time span that they thought of was very, very short. John the Baptist, was an eschatological preacher. Paul was an eschatological writer. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a very short time span as well. So if all those writers, theologians, have a short time span, why on earth would Hebrews be talking about two world religions?
That's imposing something later back onto the mindset of that time period, right?
Right. And
anachronism.
I don't know if I use this example in the book, or it's something I often think of. We didn't talk about the First World War before 1939, really. It was the Great War. But on September 1st, 1939, Second World War began, but it also so to speak, it gave a name to the First World War.
Yes.
And to talk about Judaism and Christianity at the time of Hebrews is so anachronistic, I would say. It's the word the scholars use when they want to say it's using an idea from a later time and pressing that into first century. If we had asked Paul, handed him a microphone and asked, what do you think about the difference between the world religion Christianity from the world religion Judaism? He wouldn't understand what we're talking about. And I would say the same thing with Hebrew. So he's comparing not two religious traditions. He's comparing this world, that's in Hebrew, Haolam Hazeh, this world, and the coming world, Haolam Haba. And it wasn't easy to be a Christ believer, I believe, when Hebrews was written down. And the author wants to convey a message of comfort and to say that this world is not as good as the coming world, but indeed, Christ is the high priest already. So the services here are related to the heavenly service. So he's not comparing Judaism and Christianity, saying that Christianity won 1-0, like a zero-sum game, but he's comparing heaven and earth. And for me, that's very helpful. Very helpful to start reading Hebrews like that.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much more. And I think it's so important that I know there've been various works that have been done that have tried to, or that are seeking to understand not just Paul, not just Jesus, but other New Testament books, such as Hebrew, from the kind of the big term is post-supersessionist point of view, which is saying, hey, let's try to understand these books in their context without the replacement theology that came later, because that really wasn't part of their way of seeing things at that point, is what I hear you saying. So this is an encouraging development.
I agree. When you watch TV and you watch one of these detective stories, sometimes they send a bad cop and a good cop in when they want to interrogate someone. And Hebrews has become the bad text. So they say, well, Paul is the good text. We can save Paul. We can save the synoptics. But Hebrews has been ditched as that is necessarily supersessionist. And as you say, there's a whole new series of books and a whole new trajectory of scholarship reading the New Testament without presupposing supersessionism.
Yeah, it's very, very encouraging and helpful. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that, because these are very important, very, very important features and developments. So I want to ask you about something also that you said early in your book regarding you discussed the importance of the distinction, yet also this relationship between the terms anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. So explain to us, because I thought that was a really a very, very helpful part of the book. Help us understand these terms, Jesper, and how they're different yet related.
So if we talk about difference, the short version, I would say most scholars and those who are in this field say anti-Semitism is hating Jews, qua Jews. I don't like you because you're a Jew. And anti-Judaism would be then, I don't have a problem with you as a person, but I really don't like your religious tradition. Mm-hmm. But what I wrote in that part that I think you're referring to, that I quoted James Carroll, who wrote this tome on Constantine's sword. He said to me that this was the most difficult book to write because I wanted to survey 2,000 years of church history. And he said, we have to remember that it was holy before it became lethal. So anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism is not a new concept. Nazis rose to power in the 20th century. Marxism and its legacy of anti-Judaism in the 19th century, and conservatism in the 18th century. But for 1700 years before that, as I said in the beginning, bishops and priests and everyone, the church art, etc., in hymns, Judaism was presented as a problem to be solved and not a life to be lived. They looked, the Christians were on a fault-finding mission, find something that was wrong. And that's something that it's the most ecumenical standpoint you can find, that all Christians, they focus on Jesus of Nazareth. That's a good thing, I would say. And they try to find something that is flawed in the Jewish tradition. And it's flawed in different ways, but it's very often you say that Judaism has to be bad in order for Christianity to be good. That's also a deceptive dichotomy and a zero-sum game. Therefore, when I read James Carroll's book, I started to think of, yes, there is a difference, because I don't like you because you own all the banks or all the media, or you poison our wells, or you do this or that. There are different ways of it. But towards the end of the day, for the Jew who is suffering, who is persecuted, who is murdered, it's not that different. It's not that important to know whether was I killed because I poisoned wells, or because they think that I own all the newspapers and media in the world. So it's this focus, this insistence on blaming Jews. And there was also another quotation, I believe, in the book by John Connolly. He wrote a book on how the Catholic teaching changed in the 1930s, from 45 up until Nostra Aetate. And he said, let's see if I can find the quotation, because this is very powerful.
Yeah,
he
please.
said, Hitler could and did claim to be doing a service to Christianity by persecuting Jews, and Christianity did not have a language with which to oppose him. No matter how much Christians objected to violations of human dignity, the human person, or the sanctity of life, they were for the most part left speechless when it came to Hitler's target, the Jewish people. And this speechlessness.
I remember that quote in the book, and it stopped me. That is an incredibly powerful. Please continue, but I just wanted to note, yes, I remember the quote.
Yes.
That what you said about Christians not having a language to oppose that way of thinking is huge.
So we often think of a trajectory. So Luther said this, and therefore Lutherans a couple of 100 years ago said something similar. But this is almost going in the opposite direction. When Nazis came and said Jews are a problem, Judaism is a problem, then Christians did not have a language with which to oppose them. And this theological speechlessness that I'm addressing in my book. And it's called Addressing the Roots of Antisemitism. So sometimes the trajectory goes in this direction, and sometimes it goes in that direction. So, for example, Von den Juden und ihren Lügen by Luther was translated into Swedish in the 1930s. It did have a reception history up until then, but it's also, if you are an anti-Semite, you want to reach to see what you can find in the Christian tradition. And they looked for it and they found it. So it's disturbing. It goes in both ways.
Yes. But books like, the works we've already mentioned, Christer Stendahl,
yes.
Obviously your work. And of course there, thank God, there are plenty of other works that are coming out and that have for some time now, that are, I guess we could say, just kind of building off of this way of framing it. You're creating a vocabulary to respond in which Christians can respond to anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism within the Christian tradition itself. So it's almost like you're creating a language.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. Yes. If speechlessness is the problem, we need a discourse. We need words. We need perspectives. We need awe, gratitude, curiosity. I think those are three very important words for me. Awe, like Jacob when he comes to Bethel and he says, the Lord is here and I did not know it. That's awe. And gratitude, that I read the Hebrew Bible as a Christian but I'm do that in gratitude because it was written down by Bnei Israel, by the Jewish people, and handed on generation after generation. And had they not done that, I would not have known the text. And with curiosity, I want to know more about the Jewish tradition and its way of interpreting the texts that are important to me as well. But I'm always aware that it began with them.
Yeah. Well said. I want to kind of continue building off of where we're going. I want to share a quote from your book that I thought was very powerful. You said, "Indeed, we may even go as far as to state that it is only when we read the text, speaking of the New Testament, when we read the text without presupposing supersessionism, that we will detect the hidden treasures in the text." Now, I felt that was a very bold and very compelling statement, and it suggests that replacement theology, supersessionism, doesn't just distort our reading of the New Testament. It actually blinds us to some of its deepest insights. So talk to us, Jesper, about what you meant by that statement, and maybe even give us an example of a hidden treasure that can be found by not reading these anti-Jewish replacement ideas into the text.
So I think of supersessionism, replacement theology, the idea that somehow Christians have replaced Judaism, Christendom has replaced Judaism. I think of that as theological arrogance. And arrogance is the opposite of the virtues presented in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, the virtues that are humility and, a God-centered theology. The radical amazement that Heschel talks about. So if radical amazement and humility are virtues, something we want to explore and know more about, then arrogance is the opposite of that. And I know that many Christians, they seek to be humble in their daily life. That's difficult to achieve. And it's important that we continue doing that. But there is also theological arrogance. And that is not that often addressed. But Paul does address it in Philippians. In the second chapter of Philippians, he says, I feel that you are not humble enough. And many scholars think that he is then quoting a hymn, which is very powerful. That when we read Philippians, it's not only a window to Pauline theology, but it's also a window into early Christian services, liturgy. And it is this powerful text. I know that you know it, but perhaps not everyone who listens to us knows it. It says that you should have the same mentality as Jesus Christ had. And he
emptied
there was
himself.
a kenosis.
That's that famous, he emptied it.
He emptied himself, and he didn't think of it as a harpagmos, as something you seize. If you rob someone and you take that person's money or treasures, you rob it and take it for yourself. That's harpagmos in Greek. And it says Christ did not think of this as harpagmos, as a robbery, but he emptied himself. So I would say that's a treasury. If you start thinking of Judaism not only as the ancestor, a past, but it's a contemporary, living, vibrant religious tradition, and you start to get to know Judaism and Jewish hermeneutics and Jewish spirituality, and you don't seize that. But you have this, you refer to Christus Stendhal, this holy envy. You see that this is a beautiful Jewish legacy. I don't need to baptize it and say it's in Christianity as well, and our version is a bit better than yours. But to say that this is a beautiful, the beautiful legacy, the treasure, as you said, of Judaism. And I want to remain Jewish, and I look at it with holy envy. That would be one way of thinking of this, the hidden treasure.
Yes. So well said. And I think I'm very grateful that in our time, um, I continually meet more and more Christians who are reading uh, Jewish authors like the one you just referred to, Rabbi Joshua Heschel. I've met a number of Christians who have read his book on the Sabbath or the prophets, or he's just got some incredible insights. Or another seems to be fan favorite among some Christians is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Of both of these modern voices are no longer with us, but again, these are some examples of some modern Jewish thinkers that I see Christians engaging, and that's helping them understand their own faith better by engaging Jewish voices on these texts. So this is, I think, a promising development.
Indeed it is.
Yes. So Jesper, you've been involved in Jewish Christian relations for many years, and dialogue. And in the book, you already alluded to a few minutes ago. You talk about these 4 keywords in the book. It was and I thought those keywords are so important, and that they represent some of the most fundamental challenges to the positive development of Jewish Christian relations and understanding. So now we're not going to discuss each of the keywords because I want people to buy the book and read about them themselves. But I do want to discuss one of the keywords, which you already mentioned, but I want to dig in a little deeper. And this keyword does continue to represent a challenge for, I think, understanding the New Testament as well as how Jews and Christians understand each other. And that's the word Pharisees. And I wrote a book on Paul called The Weird Apostle. I dedicated a whole chapter to the Pharisees because it's such a big topic. But from your perspective, talk to us about some of the problems that continue to persist with the way the Pharisees have been perceived historically in Christian context, and how this perception of the Pharisees continues to be a barrier to not only understanding the New Testament, but also Jewish Christian relationships.
I think we could use the metaphor, the image of a space rocket that with 4 steps. So first, the New Testament talks about bad Pharisees. I think it says in Matthew 23, don't do what they do, but do what they say, because they say things that are right, but they don't do it. In Greek,
Yes.
It's even more concrete. It says they say, but they don't. They say, but they don't do. So obviously the earliest layer here is that there are some who belong, people in the Jewish community at the late Second Temple Judaism, and they are bad Jews. So therefore, it's a kind of bad Pharisees. And then after a while, there's a second step here, and they become typical Pharisees. That all Pharisees are bad Pharisees. And then the third step in this rocket going into space, the third step is that Pharisees are typical Jews. And then the fourth step is typical Jews also today. And maybe there's a fifth step. I don't know if we can save the image here, but that it's not only about Judaism per se, but it also becomes a Christian heresy. That the Christian always has to be aware that he has a hidden Jew in himself, and he has to avoid that. There's a quotation from Ernst Käsemann, a very influential German Protestant theologian, and he says that the verborgene Jude, the hidden Jew in all of us.
Yes.
And that is part of this legacy. I mean, the bad Pharisees become typical Pharisees, become typical Jews at the time of Jesus, become typical Jews also in our times.
Yes.
And
yes.
then
It's
it
almost like
becomes
there's this generational continuity where it's like, the Pharisees and become like what modern Jews are like, and there's just this ongoing perpetual negativity,
Yes.
that continues to not only obscure our understanding, but this has led to negative action towards Jews and Jewish communities. But please continue with, I just wanted to throw that in.
And the Swedish Academy, known for choosing Nobel Prize laureates for literature, and they also have a dictionary. And the first version that I read when I was young, it said Pharisee, hypocrite. That is what the word meant. So it could be you're doing crossword and it says Pharisee. You look it up. Hypocrite. That's what it should be.
I think that's part of popular culture. If you want to criticize somebody or label them as a religious hypocrite, you just call them a Pharisee, and everybody knows that's a very critical term. Even if you're not religious.
Later editions of the same dictionary, now it says a member of a religious community at the time of Jesus. And that is what, scholars want to achieve, but still you can't, it won't help you solving a crossword from the 1960s. So this problem, it means both. Originally, it was just a member of a religious community, religious party at the time of Jesus. And the word got wings and it's everywhere, as you said. And now you can just say, you are a real hypocrite. You are a Pharisee, and everyone would know it. So that is the obstacle here. There's an excellent book edited by Joseph Sievers and Amy Jill Levine called just the Pharisees. And they picked the best scholars from every field, not only in biblical scholarship, but also the reception history of how the Pharisees have been interpreted and applied in various contexts. The Ober Abergau, the Passion plays in etc. And so it's very, very, very important scholarship. And if you want to know more, those of you listening to this pod, I recommend that book wholeheartedly. It takes a while to read it, but it's an excellent collection of essays.
Yes, I completely agree. It's an excellent book. I've read it, and I reference it in my own book. And there's been several other books. I think Richard Horsley did a book on the Pharisees as well that was helpful in correcting some of the caricatures. And there's a Wittgenstock book. I think the author's name is Kent Yinger, who wrote a little bit more of an accessible book on the Pharisees as well. Again, challenging some of these conceptions of the Pharisees that really not only obscure our understanding of them, but hinder modern Jewish Christian relations. So, okay, I want to, considering the previous question, how would you say we need to think differently about the Pharisees that will help our understanding of the New Testament and also position us better? Like, how do we need to think differently, concretely about this? As you said, originally they were just a religious group. Paul calls himself a Pharisee. Right. He's, I think, the first source we have, first person that actually he identifies as a Pharisee, even after his the Damascus Road. So all that to say, how do we need to think differently, and what will be the results of that, do you think, about the Pharisees?
Right. So I would encourage the listeners, those who listen to this here, stop thinking of Judaism as Christianity and Phariseeism as the opposites, like the very opposite, like an ontological essence. That the Christianity is one way of thinking, the right way, and the very opposite is like. So rather, they are so close to each other. So it's almost like they're standing next to each other when they are waiting to cut the cake. And when you cut the cake, you take the piece of the cake that is next to the person that was standing next to you. So in terms of hermeneutics and angels and world to come and oral tradition and the size of the canon, what books in the Hebrew Bible one should read, etc., I would say there is no group at the time of Jesus that is as close to his movement, the Nazarenes, the Jesus movement, no group is as close to him as the Pharisees. I think the Essenes are further away, the Sadducees, etc. So stop thinking of it like this, and think of the Svartvik similitude of the cake. You're standing next to them, and the Pharisee is taking a piece of that cake, and you're standing next to him because you're so close, the affinity is there, and therefore, why should you take the opposite of the cake? Then the person who made the cake will be very angry with you. So just remember that we are so similar to each other. And Jesus was a Jew and Paul was a Pharisee. As you said, if we mean anything, it's not only a word, a mouth. I forgot the English word now. That if you not a lip service, it's not only lip service to say that Jesus was a Jew and Paul was a Pharisee. We really have to take them back into that original context.
No, I think that's so helpful, and I appreciate how your book is contributing to helping people to think differently about the Pharisees, because it doesn't, by definition, mean religious hypocrite. I mean, I think in some ways, one of the points that I made in my book is that if it wasn't for the Pharisees, we wouldn't, the Jesus, I don't know that this, it really set the ground for the Jesus movement, because, it was the Pharisees who believed in the resurrection of the dead and who, embrace the prophetic section of the Hebrew scriptures, and they believed in books like Isaiah and things like that, and the world to come and so forth. And so I think it's just like you said, they're the ones that are standing next to you, as in Jespers cake.
Right.
So very important. Okay, so I want to continue. We're talking about the Pharisees, and as we both noted, Paul identifies in the book of Philippians as a Pharisee. Acts, has him referring to himself as a Pharisee. So I want to just talk a moment about Paul and your thoughts on him. You dedicate, a section to some of the challenging texts, in Paul. But you noted a significant difference between the gospel as inspired by Christian preaching throughout history and Paul's actual historical message. You say that there's a difference there. So how would you describe Paul's original message, and how does it differ from the version that emerged later through centuries of Christian preaching? What are some of those differences?
I think it's important to remember that Paul had this vocation about Gentile inclusion, and he has been interpreted very often, unfortunately, as the apostle of Jewish exclusion. To always be focused on this. His idea was not, I need to convert from Judaism to Christianity because Judaism is a bad religion and Christianity is a good one. No, so he was called, and this is Chris Stendahl's article from the 1960s that we keep returning to all the time, but he felt that he had a vocation, and there was no conversion, vocation by the God of Israel to go to the Gentiles, to the nations, and preach about faith in the God of Israel. And that's so helpful if we understand the text in that way, that it's, as I said, Gentile inclusion, not Jewish exclusion. It's not about finding the faults with Judaism, but reaching out, covenantally embracing the Gentiles.
Yes.
He went in Acts, it says, he had this dream, and someone from Europe, and since I'm a European, I can identify with it. Someone said, come to us in Europe and help us. And it says, and preach the gospel. The verb is the verb from evangelion, and preach the gospel to us. And I often ask groups, so what do you think that he preached? And you mustn't say anything about Judaism, because these weren't Jews. These were European Gentiles who didn't know Judaism, had never been to a synagogue, and they didn't know the Torah, etc. So what was the message? And therefore, I keep thinking of this. It was a matter of Jewish Gentile inclusion, not Jewish exclusion. I don't know if I write this in the book, but I keep thinking of, since he wanted to have like a tent over the Gentiles. If the sun is very harsh, you need, perhaps in Georgia and hopefully in Sweden this summer, you need to have something parabrisa, they say in Spain, to keep the sun away so that you can be in the shade. And it's interesting that he called himself a tent maker. So he was that by profession, but he's also a theological tent maker, inviting Gentiles to come in under the covenantal canopy.
Yeah, no, and I thought you did a great job in the book with the various texts that you address, in making it very clear that Paul was, his gospel, his message was not dedicated to showing how Judaism is empty, bankrupt, and needed to be replaced. That wasn't part of his thinking at all. And so again, I encourage folks to read, and again, the value of your book. I think that when it comes down to these discussions and issues and thinking about Paul and the New Testament, it really does come down to the texts themselves and how do we understand the texts. And so I think that's, again, I appreciate that you go through these 30 texts and present the way that they've been traditionally understood, and then provide some alternatives. So that's very good. Another text, speaking of texts, that I would say is very challenging, are some texts we see in the Gospel of John. So we're gonna begin to conclude our discussion, but before we do, I want to ask you, because I feel like this is when it comes to this topic, Jewish foundations of the New Testament and addressing the roots of anti-Semitism. Of course, the Gospel of John may be, I think a case could be made. It could be the heart of this battle. So you dedicate 3 chapters in your book to various texts in the Gospel of John that present some significant challenges to Jewish-Christian relations, and you dedicate 1 chapter to the text surrounding the famous statement in John chapter 8, where Jesus speaks to a Jewish group and he says, "You are of your father, the devil." So this is, of course, understandably, this has been a text that's been deeply problematic throughout history, used to justify violence and exclusion towards Jews and Judaism. So my question for you, Jesper, is: do you think this? What are your thoughts on this passage? And is this passage in John 8, this text, is it irredeemably anti-Semitic, or is there a way to understand it that's, let's just say, historically grounded and constructive for Jewish-Christian relations?
Right. You quoted John 8:44, and it's often quoted by those who hate Jews, who detest Judaism. It seems to be like the alpha and omega of some people. They only know one text of Luther, and that's about Jews and their lies. They only know one text in the Bible, and that is John 8:44. And they write it on signs and have it on their websites, etc. So it's the alpha and omega, the beginning and the end of their way of reading the Bible. And I'm reminded of how the Bible was read and preached by slave owners who gathered slaves around them and said, slaves, obey your masters. And I remember reading a book by a former slave, and he said, it's so strange that God gave this big book to the white folks, and the only thing written in that big book is that slaves obey your masters. And then
Right.
when he learned to read, he
So
said,
sad. Yeah.
but there's more in the Bible than that.
Yeah.
It's more in the Bible than that. And there's more in the Gospel of John than that. If you take 8:44 and you divide it, you come to 4:22, where it says, salvation is of the Jews. And that was a text that was very difficult for the pro-Nazi Christians during the 30s and 40s in Europe. And they eventually said, this must be a gloss. This is something that was added to the text because that can't be original. So 8:44 and 4:22 both are in the Gospel of John. It's against also what Paul writes in Romans 11, that you are agapetoi, you are dearly beloved. And that was the very starting point of Nostra Aetate, when the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s wanted to wanted to make a reenactment, renewal of its theology. And Cardinal Bea chose that very verse in Romans 11, that you are dearly beloved. So it's all a matter of having it as a starting point. And I would say it would be deeply irresponsible to have 8:44 in John as a starting point for Jewish-Christian relations.
Yeah. Very, very well said. And again, you have some, there are some difficult passages in there, but I loved how, as you just did, you help us to see it in its broader context, and that's how we need to read that text and the
Could I just add something?
Please,
I mean,
yes.
Judaios, that we translate mechanically, as I said, with Jews. I don't know if it's helpful or not, but that just to use an American word. And Israelite. I mean, in chapter 1, Jesus looks at Nathanael and he says, there is a true Israelite.
Yes.
I mean, that would not be appreciated, endorsed by anti-Semitic Nazis, for example. They must struggle with John 1:47. So John uses the word Judaios in a way that differs from our way of using Jews. Israelite is a positive word. It can't be if you are a racist. So he seems to use it in a rhetorically negative way. There's something that he thinks, you should have my theology, and if you don't have that, you are a Judaios. But if you are a model, then you are an Israelite. So it shows that we can't just translate this into English or Swedish or other languages and think that it has an essence and that this essence will be prevail when we go from 2,000-year-old text unto modern times.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Jesper, we're about out of time, but I so again appreciate all of your insight, and that everything you poured into this book and the time you're giving us. But before we conclude, just want to ask you kind of how you see things moving forward. What do you see as the challenges and the opportunities moving forward in, let's just say, how we understand the New Testament, the Jewish foundation of the New Testament, but also in Jewish Christian relations? How do you see things? What are the challenges, and what are some of the good things you see happening?
So a good thing is that we are having this discussion now. I'm very happy that all that work I put into this project for so many years, that the book is published, and that hopefully this can help initiating programs and courses and discussions and study groups in churches. I would be very happy if that happened, if that were the case. But I keep thinking of these words that if Christians listen to this, think self-critically what you mean when you use the words Pharisees, Jews, law, and covenant, and especially New and Old Covenant. And those were 4 words. And if I just, as I said, if you're lazy and you'd only want to study a couple of Hebrew words, it's same thing here. If you just want to pose one question to yourself, it should be, do Jews have a right to be understood?
Mm.
That's for me, it's that's a starting point. It's a stepping stone for dialogue. Do Jews have a right to be understood? If not, then we can continue doing what we've been doing so well for 2,000 years, just talking about them as if they don't have a voice. And if you want to continue further to pose two questions, why did Jesus arrive and why did Judaism survive?
Mm.
And I take that from a review by John Dominic Crossan. He was reviewing a colleague's book, and he said that perhaps in different words, but I find it very helpful. Why did Christianity arrive and why did Judaism survive? And if there's a theological deep meaning for Christians that Judaism survived, not only that you allow it in your society because you believe in the liberty of religious freedom, but also it's a deep theological meaning that Jews meet Saturday mornings, open the Torah shrine, take out the Torah scrolls, read the text in Hebrew, say the same prayers that Jesus prayed, and in the same kind of room that Jesus went to when he went, before there was Sunday schools, there was a Saturday school and the Shabbat school. That was the beginning of this. So they celebrate the same holidays, they read the same text, they pray the same prayers as Jesus. That must be very, very important to reflect on. Why did Judaism survive? And eventually, as I said, why did Christianity arrive? Either you have a negative understanding of Judaism, you look for, and lo and behold, you find something that's wrong with Judaism. They are too much or they are not enough, much something. Or you find that Paul had this vocation that believing in the God of Israel, turning to the God of Israel in prayer is so important that he traveled across the Mediterranean Sea from one country to another, not to preach that Judaism is a bad religion, but that faith in the God of Israel is what matters.
Right. I love it. Yeah.
Jesper, this has been such a rich and meaningful conversation. Again, your book offers both it offers insight into the New Testament, and I think it also, very importantly, it offers, to use a good Hebrew word, tikva. It offers hope that we can read the New Testament in a way that heals rather than divides. And I think that going back to your story that you shared at the very beginning, I appreciate the example that you gave there of just the importance of learning about Jews and Judaism from Jews and Judaism, as opposed to caricatures of of the Jewish people and of Judaism. And so I think that's incredibly an important part of your story and also an important part of your work. So I appreciate your scholarship, this new book, your heart and your commitment to building bridges. So I'll be watching with interest to see what you do next. And again, I hope our listeners will pick up a copy of Jewish Foundations of the New Testament, share it with your pastor as well, and read it, keep it on your shelf, and keep referring to it. So again, Jesper, thank you for being with us in the Bridge Builders Forum today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, I would love to connect with you further, so feel free to leave a comment or send me a private message. And the best way for us to stay in touch is to sign up for the Bridge Builders Forum email at bridgebuildersforum.com. This will keep you informed of cutting-edge resources and opportunities for us to connect and learn together. Additionally, the Bridge Builders Forum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and your support helps us create content that overcomes misunderstandings and advances ideas that build bridges between Jews and Christians. So we'll be back soon to discuss more ideas that help Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other.